This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Jamal.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we have a really great show today. We actually have a lot to cover today. We're going to be talking about Biden's Kiss the Ring tour to Saudi Arabia and the apartheid state. And one of the painful ironies of him going to the apartheid state and the medieval kingdom of Saudi Arabia is that there's going to be a historic flight from Jeddah to Tel Aviv on the presidential, Air Force One. Never before happened that we know of publicly. So we'll be talking about that. We are going to talk a little bit about the ongoing trauma of Shireen Abu Akleh's family and the extended journalism community in the world. Her family has demanded to meet with Biden. Biden will go to the West Bank. He will be in Jerusalem. We'll see if that happens. And then, interestingly, an article that came up in Haaretz did in fact show that the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem the land that it's on was previously owned by Palestinian families, and this was published in Haaretz. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Before we get to those stories, Jamal, we're going to watch a really wonderful interview you did with Ronnie Barkan, who was part of this group that was able to shut down Israeli arms manufacturer Elbit Systems in Bristol, UK. He and 9 other people are out on bail, but the trial starts in April 2023, and you had a really great interview with him. So we have a lot to go over today.
That's right, Jess. For those who are not familiar with what's going on, Palestine Action is a group of activists, international activists, Palestinians, activists, Israeli activists from the UK and different European countries. Have been going, which I didn't know, that Elbit has more than half a dozen manufacturing sites in the UK,
right,
focusing on manufacturing drones that basically keeps the largest open-air prison in Gaza basically under watch, and some of them, of course, are killer drones. They can use them to launch missiles and other things. And so these activists, number one, they've outed the collaboration by the British government with the Israeli government to allow them to manufacture these drones in the UK. And 2, they've been disrupting their operations, and from what my understanding, at least 3 of these sites have been permanently shut down, and the latest one, they've been temporarily interrupted. But it's really, the whole purpose is to shine a spotlight about what's going on in Britain, and a lot of the Brits are unhappy about it.
As they should be.
That this is happening on their own land, and as you know, Britain is in a turmoil. Its prime minister has resigned, so they have a kind of a caretaker government until they assign another prime minister. Many of his cabinet members have resigned, and the economy is in shambles because Britain took the lead, along with other European countries, to sanction Russia and take sides with Ukraine, and now they're feeling the pain from all these economic sanctions, from shortages in fuel and food. And today, for the very first time, I was listening to Germany's premier telling the German people to take showers every other day. I mean, when did you hear that ever, or when did you hear that last?
Not since World War II, Jamal. And just one other thing quickly about Boris Johnson in the UK. The apartheid state's biggest supporter in the UK in recent memory has in fact been Boris Johnson and his party. The Conservative Party in the UK, and it's coming under it's going to be a shambles, but it is moving to the right. So that's important to realize in this, what you and Ronnie are going to talk about in the upcoming interview. But the other thing that the the other reason the UK economy is getting hit right now is that they are feeling the negative consequences of exiting, going through Brexit.
That's
And kind
right.
of cutting off ties with the European Union economically. That decision, which was spearheaded by Boris Johnson, proved to be economically pretty disastrous, in addition to what you said about the Russian, the cooperation with the, dealing with Russia during the Ukrainian war. But all of these things kind of focus the mind on what Ronnie Barkan and his allies have done to shut down Elbit, which was bringing in a lot of money apparently to the UK, and shutting it down has really significant economic consequences, I guess.
That's right. So let's listen and watch Ronnie Barkan. Elbit Systems is Israel's largest private arms company and markets its weapons as combat-proven on Palestinians. Two Palestine activists were imprisoned and after being arrested on May 15th, and this is the Nakba Day, the commemoration of the 1948 Nakba, which saw 800,000 Palestinians ethnically cleansed from Palestine at Elbit Systems Bristol headquarters offices. These activists took direct action against Elbit Systems to demand an end to British complicity with Israeli apartheid. Joining us today is one of these activists, Ronnie Barkan. Ronnie is a longtime Jewish Israeli activist and math teacher, also co-founder of Boycott from Within. He describes the Israeli treatment of Palestinians as apartheid, identifies himself as anti-Zionist, and refers to Israel as the white supremacist entity founded on the basis of ethnic cleansing and ethnic segregation. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Ronnie.
Thank you, man. Thank you for having me.
So tell us about Elbit and why so many activists are targeting this Israeli company, particularly in England.
Yes, I was just watching the Twitter feed of Palestine Action, where today some activists took over the rooftop of Thales factory, which is an arms factory based in Glasgow, Scotland, and which manufactures bombs and drones. It is notorious for its activity and murderous activity, and it is also participating in a project of, along with Elbit, for drone surveillance and more than surveillance, basically using of drones to terrorize and to kill people around the world, including in Palestine, including in Afghanistan and other places. So I was just getting updates before our interview here, and I saw that the activists who have been occupying the place since the early morning, they have been taken now into custody, and I would just like to inform the audience and that they should definitely follow up on these activities that are ongoing. I participated in an action during Nakba Day. We were 9 activists who took action against the Elbit headquarters in Bristol. Elbit is the largest arms firm, Israeli arms firm. It supplies over 85% of the drones for the Israeli army, drones that are used not only to survey, but also to kill people, to terrorize them. These drones are hovering overhead 24 hours. People live in fear of these drones, and I know of direct victims. Some have been killed and some have barely survived from these drone attacks, including young children. So we took action against that headquarters in Bristol. We were arrested. After a few days, some have been released on bail, while 2 of us, Stavitsi and myself, who are Israeli dissidents, not UK citizens, have been held on remand for a month and released 30 days later.
I know you can't talk about the details of the arrest, but you said something very important. The you're an Israeli citizen, so you were held longer than, I guess, the other participants were UK nationals or European nationals. Tell us a little bit about if you can share that, your experience. How were you treated when you got arrested?
Yes, I cannot go into too much detail because obviously there is an ongoing investigation, and we are expecting trial in April of next year. So rather than going into too many details, I will say that indeed we got arrested. I also suffered injuries during the arrest. Afterwards, like you said, we were there was both harsh bail conditions for those who were released after a few days, and the two of us who are not UK citizens were held on remand in prison for a month and are still right now under harsh bail conditions. So all 9 activists have been treated quite harshly, and we have to remember that we were held on remand and under these harsh bail conditions, even though the trial has not started.
Well, I mean, you said the trial is going to be April next year. Is this normal to wait almost a year for a trial?
The situation in the UK is deteriorating on many fronts, including the length of time that people have to await trial. There's also actually even a barrister strike happening, along with other strikes that are happening in the UK for different reasons, for different because the situation here is getting worse, and we are also seeing that with regard to the pending trial. So until that time, all 9 activists are bound to the UK, including the ones who are not UK citizens.
So basically, you're stuck in the UK. Just to make that clear, you cannot travel. You cannot go back to
I cannot
to your
travel,
hometown.
And at the moment, I'm also at the moment we're also as far as I know, Stavitsina and myself, I don't know. We're not allowed to communicate, so I do not know about the situation of all the 9. But there's also tagging. So basically, I have to be at home under curfew every night. So from 10 p.m. I have to be at home every day.
I mean, I know England is not a cheap country. I mean, it's not a bad country to be stuck at, but it's not a cheap country. How do you support yourself? I mean, you're stuck there. You have to pay for your expenses. How do you support yourself?
Yes, this is quite an issue that I had to change my entire life and plans. I was living in Portugal, and now I am indeed stuck here in the UK. But I'm happy to say that there was a lot of support, both while we're in prison and since we were released. It is really heartwarming to see the amount of support from regular people who support the cause, who feel that we are clearly on doing something that is on the right side and from all the best intentions. So I got all these wonderful messages while in prison. I am hosted by a wonderful person here in Brighton, by the beach. So I cannot complain about my conditions. I'm relatively well, but obviously the conditions overall are very limiting. At the same time, I would like to take the opportunity of being here in order to raise awareness to the situation. So the fact that the authorities are trying to limit us, limit our freedom of movement and other freedoms will not also limit our freedom of expression. So I will definitely take the time while I'm in the UK to speak up as much as I can about Elbit and the entire Israeli murder machine.
What role does Israel play I guess, in your arrest. I mean, have you been contacted? Usually, a foreign national, when he or she gets arrested overseas, the embassy contacts them. I mean, have they been involved, or they're just happy to keep you at bay?
I have not heard from the Israeli embassy. I wouldn't be surprised if they were involved in other ways that I am not aware of, but I have not heard, and I will not be contacting them.
So we've had this conversation before when we've had you on the show a few times. Again, tell our audience, why are you doing what you've been doing? You know, really, pretty much taking the time, subjecting yourself to arrest, you know, speaking out against Israeli atrocities. I know when you've been there, you get harassed, you get stopped, you get questions, and you being a Jewish Israeli.
Yeah. So you mentioned Israeli atrocities, and we have to understand that there is a system of oppression that was founded since the very foundation of the State of Israel. Since 1948, at the latest, Israel is practicing what amounts to the crime of apartheid. It is also practicing colonialism and military occupation, a harsh, brutal military occupation, and pillage, and many other and ongoing war crimes. But especially when we talk about the crime of apartheid, we cannot downplay this. This is regarded in the law among the most severe crimes, the most atrocious crimes. It is defined as a crime against humanity, on par with genocide. So if governments are not doing what they are obligated to do to stop these horrendous crimes, which are crimes against humanity, it is up to us, civil society, individuals, organizations, to stand up for these rights. Having said that, it applies doubly when I am actually among those who are among the privileged group who stand to benefit from, or supposedly benefit from, these crimes. So I'm an Israeli dissident. I oppose pretty much everything that Israel stands for, because it was built, as I mentioned, as an apartheid state in order to allow privileges to people like myself of my ethnic racial background at the expense of all the others, at the expense of, so 7 million people who are among the privileged group by law benefit at the expense of the 12 million Palestinians who have been subjugated and terrorized and oppressed and exiled and murdered ever since the foundation of the State of Israel. So 7 million control the lives of another 12 million people, half of which are in forced exile for the past 7 decades, for one and only one reason, because they do not belong to the correct racial ethnic category. Because they have other ethnicity, they are denied the right to go back home. And the whole system is based around that, around racial domination of one group against others. This is something that we definitely have to stand up against. Just like there was the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, which after many decades, we won that struggle. Just like there were other struggles around the world against other forms of oppression. This is a very serious crime that is taking place in front of our eyes. And Elbit is a chief representative, an example, a glaring example of that. And we held that specific action when I got arrested on Nakba Day. Nakba is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in order to allow that system of oppression to happen. But the Nakba is an ongoing process. The ethnic cleansing and the racial domination is an ongoing process, and Elbit is utilizing that as we speak. So everything that is happening in Gaza, which over 70% of the population of Gaza are actually refugees from 48, from what is regarded today as Israel proper. Over 70% of the people of Gaza are refugees, and they are stored in this warehouse for the unwanted, basically the unwanted spare human beings. They have been stored in that place called the Gaza Strip, which is a concentration camp controlled by Israel, by air, sea, land, etc. And when it is controlled by the air, it is controlled with Elbit drones. When people are being shot at and terrorized, they are most likely Elbit is involved in the manufacturing of those weapons. And this is an ongoing process. So we have to listen to, for example, how people in Gaza are experiencing this form of state terrorism against them via these technological tools. And these technological tools are actually manufactured here in the UK. There used to be 10 factories and sites of Elbit Systems in the UK. 2 of them have been shut down recently. One was shut down over half a year ago in Oldham, and the other one just recently, just after we got released from prison, we learned that the London headquarters of Elbit has been shut down due to ongoing protests there at that site in the center of London. So now the active Elbit headquarters is that in Bristol, the one that I was demonstrating at.
So you feel that these actions basically are making an impact in your mind, at least to remind, because I think until the demonstrations by the activists, very few people have heard even of Elbit, let alone to know that, as you've mentioned, there were 10 factories in the UK.
I think that the fact that a handful of activists who are supported by many more, as I said, there is a very broad range of support from regular people in the UK and around the world. And this is really heartwarming, and this is really important, because what is happening here is that basically a movement, is happening. It is not up to a certain individual or a certain organization, but there is a movement of people who are speaking up and are saying enough is enough. And the fact that this is happening, and the fact that these relatively few people are able to bring this to light, to bring this to the media, and the fact that the Elbit murder is successful. I know that Elbit has sold its factory in Oldham about half a year ago at a loss. They purchased it at around 15 million pounds, and they sold it at under 10. So, this was, even though it was framed as another business activity, it was not a profitable one. It was probably as a result of other things that were happening.
So President Biden is going to meet with the new Israeli government soon. What are your expectations from him? Do you expect anything different from Yair Lapid, for example?
No, I think that I do not expect anything from any representative in the Israeli apartheid parliament. Lapid is actually, his ticket was basically about fighting the BDS struggle, the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against Israel. That very campaign, which demands the 3 fundamental rights of the Palestinians, which are protected by international law and human rights conventions. And so obviously, Lapid is not concerned about Palestinian rights. And when we're talking about Palestinian rights, we're talking about ending of that brutal military occupation. We're talking about equality for those who are second-class citizens in what is regarded as Israel proper. And finally, and most importantly, the rights of the refugees, those who have been exiled for the past 7 decades and are denied the right to come back home because they were born to the wrong ethnicity. This is what, opposing all of these, this is what the current acting Israeli Prime Minister represents. I do not think that we have to look up to this meeting between Biden and Lapid. Israel, for every intent and purpose, is the 51st state of the US when we regard US foreign policy. I mean, there are their foreign policy kind of goes hand in hand. So, yeah, I wouldn't expect much. Obviously, they are trying to divert the attention and to point at other players, whether it is Russia, whether it is Iran, and so on. But I suggest that they will also look at the mirror, or look themselves in the mirror, and start asking the real questions about what do they stand for, and why don't they abide by their own obligations under the law.
Well, here is the irony in this trip, and we'll probably talk about it during the rest of the show. But President Biden is starting his trip by going to Saudi Arabia, another violator of human rights, and also where its crown prince is responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist who worked for the Washington Post and lived in the United States. And now he's going to Israel, and that's something I wanted to ask you about. And this is a country that recently was responsible for the murder of a Palestinian American journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh. I mean, this is kind of like the crazy thing is like the two countries the US president has decided to visit are the two abusers of human rights in the entire area. Do you feel that the Israeli government at any point would assume accountability for the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh?
Unfortunately not. And my heart goes out to the family of Shireen and all the others who have been targeted, and the perpetrators receive impunity, whether by Israel or the US. But we do have to demand justice for Shireen. And this, by the way, this murder of the Al Jazeera journalist happened just a few days before the action against Elbit. Now, I mentioned that the United States and Israeli foreign policy is pretty much the same. And the fact is that all of those players in the region, also including Saudi Arabia and so on, for them, war is a business. Exactly the thing that we are trying to challenge here. The whole accords between Israel, the Abraham Accords and so on, they are a business deal for selling American and Israeli weapons to these countries. There's a lot of money involved in these deals that are happening. And so it is not surprising that Biden is meeting both the Israeli and the Saudi representative together, because they are business partners in this, and this is how we should be looking at that. The fact that the US doesn't even ask for accountability for its own citizens when they have been executed by Israel, and we have pretty good knowledge of what has happened and who the perpetrators are. This is very, very worrying, and I think that we should make an effort not to be silent about that, to carry on demanding that, because we're talking about a person in the media, a person who has access to, not someone who was silenced and can be just this story can be brushed under the carpet. Quite the contrary.
Well,
a journalist in a respected media channel.
And unfortunately, they've done it before, even though this wasn't a journalist, but we know the case of activist Rachel Corrie. She was murdered, and despite all the attempts to conduct an investigation and for Israel to take accountability, up to this day, they've never taken accountability for her murder.
Right. I attended the hearings and also translating for the Corrie family, and sending them my regards right now. So yes, I've seen the procedure in the Israeli courts which it looked like a kangaroo court. There was no seeking of accountability whatsoever in the court. And I remember how the perpetrators were actually, their identity was protected. They were protected obviously by the authorities. They're also protected by so-called organizations which claim to break the silence, but instead they are making sure that the facts of those incidents will never ever see the light of day. So as far as I know, I am not 100%, but as far as I know, breaking the silence actually does have the identity of the person who has killed Rachel Corrie, but they will never ever release that of their own accord, because they have never broken the silence. They have collected hundreds and thousands of testimonies. They have corroborated them. They have been very clear about the fact that they never release anything that has not been corroborated. So they do have the facts, but they have never published a single fact in their entire existence. They have self-censored everything. Then they also send everything to the military censorship. And what is the ending result are stories which are based on facts, but are redacted of any valuable information like times, dates, names, chain of command, types of ammunition, and so on.
Well, Ronnie Barkan, thank you again for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you for having me. And I think that it is important to remember that we do have to stick to the facts. We do have to talk about the facts, not just tell the general story, but point the finger. If it is Elbit, we have to mention Elbit. If it is the identity of Shireen Abu Akleh and the silencing of that story, we have to demand that this story will not be silenced.
Thank you again, and best of luck. And just quickly, people want to keep track of what's happening with Elbit. Is there a website they can go to?
They should Google Palestinian Action website, and also, as well as on Twitter, and they can follow me. I make sure to retweet as much as I can about that, whatever I can do without discussing my own issue, which is an ongoing trial.
That's the voice and the face of Ronnie Barkan, basically pro-Palestine activists, and speaking about the upcoming trial that he and his colleagues are scheduled to be on for April in 2023. I mean, have to give these guys so much credit, Jamal. Shutting down Elbit in the UK is no small task, but also speaks, frankly, to the consciousness of UK citizens, basically, and their appreciation of what the apartheid state has done in terms of the assault on Palestinians and the assault on justice there. So it's quite a compelling story.
Absolutely. So moving on to our next story, Jess, and I'm using this terminology in quotes, this historic trip. And Biden says this Mideast trip, and I'm quoting here, is a symbol of budding relations between Israel and the Arab world. And then the media has been describing this flight as a historic trip because it's the first trip, as you've mentioned earlier, where a U.S. president flies directly on Air Force One between Jeddah and Tel Aviv. So what historical part do you see about this, Jess?
Well, I don't see anything really historic about it, to be honest. I see something really, really in terms of the political consequences, really pretty awful for Biden, pretty awful for the United States. And the only winners here are, MBS and the apartheid state, which is going through its own political chaos right now because, the parliament has been disbanded yet again in the apartheid state. There's going to be the 5th or the 6th election in 2 or 3 years. They're kind of economically also struggling right now because of COVID and other things. And, listen, MBS and the apartheid regime are the only beneficiaries, because one of the things that the mainstream media is not telling you, Jamal, is that MBS has already, in Saudi Arabia, have already told Biden that they're not planning on changing their cooperation with Russia. They're not planning on changing their oil and economic relationship with Russia. And, the other kind of digging deep into the weeds here on this, Saudi Arabia is not going to increase more oil production. Their refining capacity is almost maxed out now. And given the price of oil, its fluctuations up and down, the Saudi medieval regime has already told the Biden administration that don't expect much help from Saudi Arabia in changing the oil crisis. So the only thing that's historic, in my humble opinion, Jamal, is that you have a weak president bending over backwards, kissing the ring of an apartheid regime, as well as a thug in the Middle East at the medieval kingdom with MBS. And what is so historic about that? It's going to make him look weak and foolish, Jamal.
Well, I'll tell you what's actually so historic about that. It's a first flight of its kind between a medieval kingdom and an apartheid state. So that's how I see it. But before we got on the show, Jess, I saw this new poll for Biden's disapproval rating, not approval rate, disapproval rating. It's about 77% disapproval rating.
Right.
While at the same period, for the last president who had something close to this was
Donald
Trump.
Jimmy Carter, right.
Jimmy Carter, but it was 66% disapproval rating. And
Right.
of course, we know what happened to Jimmy Carter. He lost the elections. So
one-term president, just like,
yes. So Biden beat Jimmy Carter, which is, I find it very hard actually to think about, because going back to Jimmy Carter, in a disapproval rating. So whatever he does, I don't know what he's going to do. He's just going to, every single president had to do that pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia and to Israel, our closest allies in the Middle East, and then Biden's trying to revive the so-called Oslo agreement, which is nonsense, just for a photo op, to go have a photo op with the new Israeli prime minister and then meeting with Mahmoud Abbas is not going to help his rating.
I think it's going to hurt it, Jamal.
No, the other statistics that I saw, which was what Americans are concerned about, the 5 most important things, and number 1 was inflation, and number 2, I think, is the economy, and number 2 is the price of oil, number 3 is the economy, number 4 is
gun violence.
Not gun violence, again, something to do with the economy, like in general. Number 5, which kind of like is Roe v. Wade. I'm talking about, actually, I shouldn't say Americans. This is the Democrats.
Oh, Democrats. Yeah.
Democrats it's even for Democrats, because they got a little bit of a bump in the ratings because of what happened, the disaster that happened at the Supreme Court. It only improved the ratings by 2%. So still, even the most important, abortion is like the 5th most important issue, or 6th most important issue. The first 5 important issues all deal with the economy, and Biden destroyed that.
That's right, Jamal. But here's the problem: when he scheduled the trip, it's when people were screaming about oil prices and gasoline prices. So he felt like he had to do something. And it's proven and will prove to be, Jamal, a politically disastrous trip for him.
Especially since we mentioned this on the last show, that he labeled MBS as a pariah, or the whole Saudi regime as a pariah state. And now he's going to kiss the ring.
He's going to legitimize MBS. And by the way, I think it's important, another thing, I'm sure you read about this, but there was a report by one of MBS's former top intelligence inner circle people, who's now kind of left and is in exile right now. And he basically said that MBS is a psychopath and in an extreme danger to the psychopath and danger
Somebody,
to.
when you take one of your citizens and chop him to pieces in your
You're a
own
psychopath.
embassy, you're a psychopath. I don't
Right.
know what other explanation. But anyway, we will be reporting on this because
Right.
As it happens. And I want to go back again to Biden's trip, because then Biden is going to go to meet with Mahmoud Abbas and meet with Yair Lapid, the Israeli Prime Minister. And then there is something very important, because we spoke about this to an extent during the last show, how the United States basically has been sweeping under the rug the murder of an American citizen and a journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh. And so now the family has demanded publicly, they've sent a letter to the State Department, sent a letter to the White House, demanding, and I'm just quoting parts of that letter. The letter says, in the days and weeks since an Israeli soldier killed Shireen, not only have we not been adequately consulted, informed, and supported by the United States government officials, but your administration's actions exhibit an apparent intent to undermine our efforts toward justice and accountability for Shireen's death. Then they go on, they say, all available evidence suggests that Shireen, a U.S. citizen, was the subject of an extrajudicial killing. Yet, your administration has thoroughly failed to meet the bare minimum expectation held by a grieving family to ensure a prompt, thorough, credible, impartial, independent, effective, and transparent investigation that leads to true justice and accountability for Shireen's killings. So they're asking to meet with him.
It's not going to happen.
Because we don't know if even he read the letter. I mean, even though the letter has been published on several sites, including, I think, AP and Reuters and, of course, Al Jazeera and others, in the media, and it was sent to the State Department and sent to the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The question is, has that letter landed on the desk of Biden, or is he choosing to ignore it, Jess?
Well, of course he's choosing to ignore it, Jamal, because there's just no way that President Biden has the emotional, intellectual, moral integrity to be able to sit down with the family of an American citizen who's been murdered. He'll talk to Brittany Griner's wife. He'll talk to Paul Whelan's family. These are both individuals who are American citizens in Russian prisons right now who are being held. But he refuses to talk to the family of an American citizen and journalist who is murdered by the so-called number one ally of the United States. And he just doesn't have the backbone. He doesn't have the backbone. He doesn't have the moral authority or integrity to sit down and talk with the Abu Akleh.
Didn't have a decency to pick up the phone, because as you've mentioned, actually, the athlete who's held in Russia,
Brittany Griner.
Brittany Griner, he actually spoke to her family, and he made kind of a commitment that the United States is not going to abandon her.
And the same with Paul Whelan's family. He's another American that's stuck in Russia right now. And these are Americans who are under really terrible conditions in a Russian prison, but they're alive. Yet you have this American citizen who's murdered by an ally, and we have radio silence. In fact, what we have, Jamal, is complicity between the US government and the apartheid regime in covering up the details, because we spoke about this last time with this ridiculous report that was issued by the US government in the so-called initial investigation. It should be final investigation, because they're not going to be doing anything else. The kind of weak conclusions that they made. So I don't see that Biden's going to meet with the Abu Akleh family. This is already a disastrous trip for Biden. I see this as really problematic. And if the one thing, if you look at a poll that just came out today, the majority of Democrats, in fact, do not want Biden to run for re-election. We're not talking about the entire country, Jamal. We're talking about hardcore Democrats who say that they do not want to see Biden run for a second term. So he's digging himself deeper in a hole of a political hole.
Well, it's a shame. It's a shame, actually, that he has abandoned an American citizen and her family, and will be a shame that he will not meet with them. Hopefully, he'll meet. I mean, I don't expect him to do anything,
I don't
even
expect it, Jamal.
even like a meeting just to express his condolences and make, even if they were empty promises, to say that we are going to do everything to get to the bottom of this. And
But
he's
what
not
about
gonna,
Jamal? What about having a condolence, book at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem for an American citizen that has been murdered? That is typical protocol, that if an American is killed in foreign soil, the embassy has a condolence book in which people can come by and sign it. The U.S. Embassy has no decency in being able to do that. And by the way, I guess that's a good segue to our next segment, right? Because that U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem is on stolen Palestinian land.
well, this is the land for the, just to make a slight correction, Jess, everything is on stolen Palestinian land. I mean, we know in 1948 Palestinians lost pretty much 98% of their land. So anywhere you go in Jerusalem or in Haifa or in Akka or any major city, the homes, the buildings, the land belonged to Palestinians. So this is actually the land that is planned for the new U.S. Embassy.
Right.
So they're planning to move the new U.S. Embassy. There was, of course, Palestinians knew that all along, but this is the first time that the Israeli paper Haaretz put documentation showing the proof of ownership. So, of course, ahead of President Biden's visit to Israel and the West Bank. So the Palestinian families, just because they have designated now, Israel designated the land to give to the Americans to build the new U.S. embassy, the so-called unified embassy, because they got rid of the embassy in Tel Aviv, and they have canceled the consulate that used to serve Palestinians in Jerusalem. So that's the combined kind of new building, and basically the families came forward and said, "Hey, wait a minute. We have
That's
proof
our
of
land.
ownership. Not only we have ownership, because this land, by the way, belongs to several families, because it's a big plot of land." And they came and they said, not only we have proof of ownership of the land, but we also have contracts that we were leasing the land to the British government. So they have, because this is how Israel works the system. They say, well, this is a government land because it belonged to the British government, but the British government was leasing it from these Jerusalemite families before 1948. So those families, basically, they're asking President Biden, hey, don't make the mistake and take over our property from the Israelis, because this has been it was confiscated by them. So they have basically, along with legal representation by the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, Adala, you heard of the organization there. They presented documents to the current, I guess, U.S. Embassy now, the temporary U.S. Embassy, showing proof of ownership and showing proof of leases that this land belonged to them before 1948. The families, including the Habib family, the Kulebo family, the Khalidi family, the Razak family, the El Khalili family, they all brought forward decades worth of rental contracts just between them and the mandatory government for the land, which was the British government. So one of the documents, we are looking at the documents, the British government paid about 30 liras per dunam each year for the land. Because I told you, I don't know how many dunams, but it's a lot of dunams, which was owned by the Palestinians. The land is located west of the Green Line, the so-called Green Line. And like all other Palestinian property in West Jerusalem, it was transferred via, Israel has this Kakamemi law called the absentee property law into Israeli hands in 1950. So they push you out of your land and they declare you are an absentee, and then they confiscate the land.
Yeah, and so this is why uh, Joe Biden's moral authority as the president of the United States is such a failure, Jamal, because you know that he's going to take the marching orders from the apartheid regime. There's nothing that's going to be said with it, but on the positive side, because Adala is involved with this, and we have this compelling legal evidence about the land being leased, perhaps that there could be a very large legal case charging the U.S. government property lease rights and charging them. I mean, the property is so valuable right now; it's got to be hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of the lease per month, right?
Well, here is a caveat. Some of these owners of the land are American citizens, including the Khalidi family. You're aware of, the Palestinian American professor Rashid Khalidi at Columbia University. This land belongs to his family. So as an American, he can sue differently than someone who's as an American citizen. This is meaning your own government, the United States, is stealing your land from you. It's not just never mind the Israelis who stole it first, but this is the Americans are stealing this land. So they wrote a letter basically. So these they've sent a letter requesting that the U.S. government cancel the plan to move the embassy on their land. And so they cannot claim they're unaware, or we got it as from the Israeli government or something like that. This is proven. They have documents, they have leases, they have American heirs to these lots of land. And eventually it's going to come back to bite the State Department in the behind afterwards, because it's going to be not only
so Jamal, let me ask you a question. Could the U.S. government under a Democrat administration be any more foolish and dismissive of Palestinian rights and Palestinian claims of sovereignty and self-determination? I mean, we expected it under the Trump administration, but it seems like this ongoing abysmal record of affront to Palestinian integrity and sovereignty and self-determination is being carried on by the Biden administration. This is a perfect example.
Exactly, because this land has been set aside by Israel since the 1990s. And every single administration has refused to move the embassy from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem until Trump came into power, and then they moved it to a temporary basically location. And now Biden, instead of saying, hey, wait a minute, I've served in the Obama administration as vice president, and we refused to move the embassy, and we refused to appropriate this land. And he's now coming to really basically support Trump's huge mistake, basically getting the United States involved. And the Israelis getting more brazen, because even just to cite another example, that after the new Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid took his post, he decided to move outside to a temporary residence outside the Prime Minister's residence into a building seized from a Palestinian family who fled in 1948. And so even within the Israel, in doing so, he broke a long-standing principle for Israeli premiers. The past two prime ministers have turned down proposals, for example, to move into the absentee properties. And so now even the Israelis, they're taking the lead from the Americans. They say, well, if the Americans are accepting the fact that now we can appropriate the land and ignore the rights of the original owners, so why don't we do the same thing and move our premier
Jamal,
into stolen properties?
Exactly. So this goes back to what we began with today. If Joe Biden wants to go and kiss the ring of MBS, a thug, a psychopath, and a killer, why wouldn't the apartheid regime and the Israeli prime minister, why wouldn't they take full advantage of his weakness and do something like that? That's why this trip is a disaster.
So the historic part about this trip, just aside from the flight between a medieval kingdom and an apartheid state, the historic part is that Joe Biden is going to whitewash the Saudi regime and the Israeli apartheid regime in during the same trip.
Right. And that's all I could say, Joe Biden, is that if you wanted to do something to make your presidency even weaker, you've been successful. You've just weakened your presidency even more. And basically, your credibility as the moral authority for the so-called greatest country in the world under your leadership is completely tarnished yet again.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest episodes, and we will talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.